I'm Chris Volker, the Assistant Director of the OCC, and there's Roe Kirby-Strager, who is the Director of the OCC, and we're so happy to have you here today for our workshop series. If you're here for COM 107, welcome. If you're here for just improving your own knowledge and how you can better apply science communication techniques to your own presentations, welcome as well. If you like what you see today, we encourage you to come back. We have a multitude of workshops, all on a variety of topics, and we do one-on-one consultations, group consultations, whatever your speaking needs are. We're happy to help you out. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Zubin. I'm not going to pronounce your last name, Zubin, because I don't want to embarrass myself. But Zubin is a PhD candidate in the MAP school. He holds a master's degree in architecture, and he's had jobs that include a teacher, designer, project leader, all for various organizations. So Zubin will take it from here, and let's give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much. So today we'll talk about science communication, and one of the things I really want to start with is, why does communication matter? Does anyone want to jump in and talk about it? Why is it important to communicate science? Yes? Go ahead.
I guess if scientists don't talk to each other, then making the project come to fruition would be very difficult, because you can't do it by yourself, essentially.
Absolutely, because most of science is collaborative, and in fact most activities these days are collaborative. Another factor is that a lot of science these days is interdisciplinary, right? You're not just talking about one discipline. Think about the field of biomedicine or the field of bioengineering, where you are looking at some two fields that were almost considered diametrically opposite now coming together. I mean, think of the invention of the pacemaker. You could have never made that unless an electronics engineer and a doctor got down together and spoke about it. And somebody at some point must have made a presentation that impressed the idea that we could somehow use an electrical device to power a biological device. So communication matters in part because it is essential to the fabric of the way science is done, so the way science functions. But I think at the student level it matters even more in a way, because what happens is, with science, the way we communicate is not just about communication, but about what we have thought. So your thought process, no matter how nuanced and how sophisticated, has to be communicated for it to become effective. So for you to be effective in your messaging, you need to figure out how to communicate whatever you have learned as well as you can. So for today's agenda, I have 3 items on the agenda. One is communication strategies. So basically I wanted to go from here knowing a few strategies that will help you communicate whatever scientific research or knowledge that you have in as effective a way as possible. The second is, of course, PowerPoints. The fact is that the PowerPoint or the Prezi these days are essential tools to communication. There is very little communication without PowerPoint, and rightly so, because it's a very powerful tool. It's a very effective tool if used correctly. And the final piece is, of course, confidence. I know this is a little bit out of the purview of this talk in some ways, but at the same time, one of the reasons I joined the PhD program in the first place is to be around people who are smarter than me. And I've been very lucky in that I know a lot of people who are incredibly smart, but I also know a lot of people who are not always efficiently communicating their ideas, and it's always a pity because they have excellent ideas. And one-on-one conversation, maybe through a technical paper, yes, they can communicate it. But when it goes to communicating it to non-technical audiences that have the power and authority to sign checks, they falter. And I think that's where the confidence piece comes in, and it's an important piece to have in your communication arsenal. So let's look at some communication strategies. I wanted to start with one of my favorite paintings, actually, and I don't want it to be about art history at all, but I really like this painting because I think it's got the gist of communication. So this is Renoir painting in the 19th century, late 19th century. And one of the things I absolutely love about this painting is this little gap here. So art historians who look at this painting tell you that Renoir paints this beautiful party scene where everybody is partying and everybody's clearly having a good time. These two young ladies are allegedly flirting with this young man here, and this young man has an eye on somebody, of course. So it's a very intriguing, interesting setting. But what the painter does here is he lets you into the painting. So you see this gap between these two benches? That's where you enter. So you are invited to this 19th century Parisian party. And I think that's really the key to good communication of any kind, scientific or otherwise, or business or political, any communication. You have to let your audience in. A lot of science communication often looks like a wall because it is filled with jargon and people look at it and they say it's intimidating. So even if it's a 19th century Parisian party, I don't see many Indians in there, but there is an entry for me here. I am still allowed to enter there without my time machine and participate in this, in this dance and in this real festival of people of sorts. So that's really the key to good scientific communication. You have to let your audience in. And for that, you have to understand what scientific communication looks like right now sometimes. So the question is, how do you put this in simple terms? If this is what your science looks like, how do you simplify it? And I don't know what your fields are, but I am always afraid of putting up this image because I'm guessing there's somebody in the audience who knows this looks pretty simple to me, right?
That's just basic trig. I don't know. What's the issue? Yeah.
Isn't it? Yes, but I assume it's not the same for the rest of us. So, so how do you simplify this? How do you make it absolutely clear? And for that, you have to use what I like to call the ideas cascade, which is a simple 3-step process. What you do first is you present the obvious, follow it up with the intuitive, and then present the counterintuitive. Now, to a person like me, this is not intuitive, right? But to you it is, in some ways. But I need something obvious. So remember the painting, how we are allowed an entry into this complicated reality? So that's what you do. You present the obvious first. What does that mean? So think of any complicated idea that you want to communicate to people. But even within that complicated idea, there is what I like to think of as a handle, which is very, very simple. So you use the simplest, the most obvious piece of a very complicated idea and present that first. So that's your entry point into the subject matter. That's where you invite the audience in. So, for instance, I just found this on Google Scholar yesterday. So if your paper title is Spatial Temporal Regulation of MYT88IRF7 Signaling for Robust Type 1 Interferon Induction, I recommend not making that the title of your talk. Right? Because it's going to shut people off instantly. And why not? And it's not only going to shut people off who are non-technical, but it's going to shut people off who are not interested in that particular thing. So you want to make the title of your talk, the introduction of your talk, as simple and as basic as possible. So always, always start with the most obvious realities surrounding whatever you're presenting. So if you're talking about pets, talk about dogs first, then move on to the crocodiles. Right? So you start with the most simple element and then move on to the more complicated element. Now once you're at the obvious, then you can start introducing the concepts which are a little more intuitive. Yeah. This is where you give people a time to think. This is where you stop and pause in your talk or in your writing for that matter. And you let people know what you're trying to tell them. So this is where you start doing the foreshadowing, that comedians often do, for instance, right? Stand-up comics will often do this technique where they introduce a concept at first, and then 5 minutes later, they'll tell you that joke again with that context. This is something like that. So this is where you start introducing concepts which are more related to your topic. So now you have moved on from what is very, very simple and very, very basic to you're going deeper into the party, so to speak. Now you've put on your dancing shoes, you've asked your audience to come in, and that's when you start introducing concepts, but again, in bite-sized proportions. Right? And finally, once you have established this framework, once you have done the groundwork for all of this, that's when you present the counterintuitive idea. That's when you come up and say, and that's how you cure cancer, or something like that. So whatever your field of expertise is, your eureka movement has to come in the end, but the audience has to be prepped for it. So the real skill in good science communication is having your audience enjoy a eureka moment. And anyway, there's good research which points that no matter what kind of communication you're doing, audio visual or just audio or even paper, people will retain about 10-15% of it anyway. So the problem is for you to choose what 10-15% you absolutely want them to remember. And that's the counterintuitive, that's your big idea. So your big idea, your contribution to the field, your contribution to the science, that's what you present in the end, but after sufficient groundwork. So no matter what your topic is, no matter how complicated it is, start by identifying what pieces of it are obvious and intuitive. There has to be something which is very, very obvious about it. There has to be something which is basic, which is introductory, right? Think about your first introduction to that subject. You may be in the 8th year of your PhD or whatever you're doing, or deep into your research. Think about the first time you got introduced to that concept as a grade school student maybe. And start with that piece and then move on to your amazing contribution to the field. One of the strategies useful in that is analogies. Analogies are very, very useful for the same reason as an introduction is. But what it allows you to do is tailor your analogies based on your audience. Now, a personal experience is when I first came to the United States, all my analogies were cricket related, entirely useless here. Apparently the cricket is an insect in America, but where I come from, it's a religion really. But all those analogies are out of the window. So sometimes when I'm talking to my students or friends, I now kind of tweak my analogies from cricket to baseball. Right? It doesn't always work, but sometimes a bad analogy is better than no analogy. Right? You have to, that's again, analogies will help you provide your audience with the handles that they need to use. So think about, if your subject matter is really complicated, think about what simple thing it is analogous to. Right? So if your paper is the spatiotemporal molecules of the interferon, fine, but it has to be analogous to something. So if it's analogous to potatoes, absolutely fine. Even if it's a bad analogy, it is kind of your job to introduce your audience to these subjects in as simple a way as possible. And then the other part is you have to, what I say, leave the hedging to the gardeners. And what do I mean by that? One of the problems with science communication and good science communication is that it's usually attempted by good scientists or people who are interested in science. And the scientific mind, the scientific approach is inherently skeptical, right? Nobody comes out and says, you will never hear a cancer researcher says, and hence we will cure cancer. They'll always say, if you have not eaten meat for 35 years before, and if you take this drug at 7 a.m. in the morning, it's always hedged multiple times. But when you're communicating to non-scientific audiences, or if you're communicating across your discipline, then it's incumbent upon you to make sure that you do not hedge too much. And the hedging will happen, but in your first introductions, in the first piece of the obvious and the intuitive, leave the hedging aside. Your hedging will happen in your scientific writing, in your paper presentations, but in communicating it, especially orally, leave the hedging aside. Do not hedge what you're about to say. The caveats will be there and you will provide them, but provide them once your audience engages with you. Because it's never fun to hear something that is completely hedged. So, yes, this is the fastest car in the world, ladies and gentlemen, but it only works in October or something like that. So leave the hedging aside as much as you can. And it's not about dumbing it down or oversimplifying it, but it's about making it absolutely crystal clear. And that's again where your audience comes in, and then they have the opportunity to ask you, oh, by the way, does it always work? Or whatever their questions may be. So the second piece that I want to talk about is the idea of PowerPoints. And everybody by now has heard of death by PowerPoint, right? Everybody has seen those PowerPoint presentations that have 300 slides and 4,000 words in them, and it feels like you're reading a paper just projected on the screen. So one of the things with PowerPoints is it's an incredibly powerful tool, but you really have to be cautious in using it, because it can really kill the mood of a room very quickly. As soon as you see a PowerPoint which has 35 charts in the first 5 slides, you're switched off. So always make sure that you have a PowerPoint that is irony-free. Right? So at least don't contradict yourself in the PowerPoint, because a lot of times you'll see PowerPoints which have some other title and something completely else down here. And so first, you should not have too many words on your PowerPoint in the first place. And if you do, let's make sure that they are all coherent with what you're saying. So what happens in many PowerPoints is there's a message up here and a contradictory message down here, and then the speaker is saying something completely different. So there's some cognitive dissonance in the audience, and they're like, what is he talking about? So be sure that you are free. You make your PowerPoint the irony-free zone. I was recently at last year I was at a conference where they were talking about geographic information systems, and the speakers, there were 2 of them, they were selling the idea of how wonderful GIS maps are. And this is just the reproduction of the slide, and this is really the slide that was put up. Does anyone spot the irony in this slide? This is an actual slide that I, without permission, unfortunately, reproduced here. So this is again, irony check, right? You make sure that you are on message. Right? Again, this goes back to the idea of caveats, or the idea of hedging, where you cannot say, here I'm promising you this, and then immediately in the next 3-4 slides, go back on that. So stay on message, right? So this is not a good way to present your slides. But of course, I'm not suggesting that all your slides must have beautiful images or photos or anything. There are occasions where you will just want text. So if you're lucky and you're incredibly smart and your final slide looks something like that, first, congratulations, good on you. But even when you're doing something as revolutionary as that, it's incumbent upon you to make sure that it's presented well. So instead of doing this, at least do that. So can you just feel the difference between these 2 slides? It's a minor effort. It takes 3 seconds longer to do this versus doing that. But it makes a big difference. And especially in a room like this, which is brighter than most rooms that you'll have for PowerPoint presentations, it really makes a difference having something which is lighter, cooler, easier to read, than having something bright and glaring. So with the PowerPoint, you have to make sure that you are analyzing the content along with the presentation. So even if your content is absolutely strong, you have to make sure that you have put that extra bit of effort in the presentation. So how do you do that? One of the challenges is to distill. So this is actually an image from my own dissertation, and it's part of my research, right? But if I put this up here, it makes absolutely no sense. And everyone has seen PowerPoint presentations that have 17 slides of this kind of material, right? And I always wonder, do you expect me to read that? Why not just give me a handout? I'll read at home. Send me an email. So if I have something like this, you have to distill it and you have to ask yourself, first, what do I really want to say? In this image, what I really want to say is this. So my research deals with city and ethnic violence, so I'm saying, okay, the city, the urban form, and ethnic violence are interrelated. That's the gist of that, right? Now, if I put this up in a scientific academic conference, there may be an accusation of dumbing it down, which is absolutely fine, but it really isn't dumbing it down. What it actually is distilling it to its core essentials. And then if I want to talk about it, I am right here. Now yes, if you're just sending your PowerPoint out to an audience who don't know anything about the subject matter, if you're using it as a Word file, sure, you can keep this. But if the author of this is standing right here, then it's his or her job to explain this in as simple a way as possible without forcing your audience members to read an unclear slide. Okay. Now let's look at the third, and in some ways the most important piece of presenting your work in a setting such that it gets communicated across well. And unfortunately, the idea of confidence gets beaten down in university campuses quite a bit. It's somehow seen as disingenuous to present your work well. Because isn't science supposed to be boring? Isn't it supposed to be communicated such that everything looks like that? And isn't that how it's supposed to look? Because that's what real scientific progress is. Why dumb down your content? And why present it well? It's supposed to speak for itself. No, the fact is it doesn't. Right? So confidence and presentation will always be an important piece because you have to start communicating your work to wider and wider audiences. And as I said earlier, most of the research now is going to be multidisciplinary. So unless you have avenues through which people can engage with your work through whatever field they are working in, you will not grow. And it's not just that other people engage with your work through your communication. When you go out and present your work confidently and communicate effectively, then it's not just a teaching opportunity. It's not just broadcasting your ideas. It's also a learning opportunity because once you communicate your ideas well, then other people will come up and say, by the way, have you heard about this? Or by the way, have you looked at this resource? Or your work would be applicable in this sector or in this field. So this being the election year, we've all kind of seen what confidence looks like. And I love this quote, which is, never underestimate a man, and I left it as man because I leave some misogyny around. So yeah, it's really true. Never underestimate a man who overestimates himself. And in some ways, all of us have seen this in action around us, right? We all have one friend who just did way better than we anticipated him or her to do, just on the basis of bluster and confidence, right? And it's really unfortunate because in that noise, good ideas get lost. So I would be really happy if good scientists and people who are engaged with science and engaged with the idea of evidence give up this kind of hubris-infilled idea that it's okay to not have good presentation as long as you have a good idea. It's unfortunately not true. No matter how good your idea is, You have to simplify it. You have to communicate it well. So do it with as much confidence as you can. And one of the ways of doing it is cognitive modeling, or better said, monkey see, monkey do. So if you have noticed that your ideas are not communicating well, if you have noticed that there is something missing in the way I communicate science, or the way I communicate my ideas about science, or the way I communicate my scientific research, find out people who are doing it well. And there are so many of them. So, my personal favorites was Carl Sagan, excellent communicator. And in whatever field you are in, you can find somebody who's doing it really well. And it's not really copying it, right? Because think about it in a sort of humble, honest way. Everything you've learned so far, you've learned through imitation. Your language, your skills, the science that you've learned how to do, it's all through imitation. So why not learn speaking or communicating in the same way? And it's absolutely fine to find somebody who does it well within your field and see what is working there, and use those techniques. So one of the things in focusing, in communicating well, is focusing on the big picture, and that really helps with the confidence piece of good communication. I've noticed people who struggle with communicating well and who struggle with presenting their ideas are often focused on a very narrow picture of my speech today or my idea presented today. But if you really, truly, deeply engage with whatever field you're in, if you're in computer science or if you're in biology or whatever field you're in, and focus specifically on the big picture instead of yourself, then the confidence piece becomes that much easier. So always engage with the real big picture and say, okay, how am I contributing to this big idea of within my field, whatever your field is. And again, simplify. Simplifying is not dumbing it down. They are completely different things. In fact, simplifying is about making sure that it's easy to communicate. That you have, as we saw in the beautiful painting, you have avenues for your audience to come into your field and engage with you. So when you simplify, you're effectively making sure that your field, your talk, your communication has these handles that people can play with. So whatever you're communicating, make sure that it's simple and it's effective. And for it to be effective, it will have to be simple, because everything is going to be interdisciplinary the moment you step out of school. Because you will almost never have the luxury of talking to people only from your field, especially if you become the researcher. So the research I do in planning and geographical systems, I am really the only one doing it. Like, I have no peers in my dissertation research. People do similar stuff, but if I have to communicate my research effectively, then I have to make it simple and accessible to whoever I speak to. So finally, I want to speak about a few simple ideas, and I think of them as tips and tricks. And if you go online, you'll find 100 tricks of effective public speaking. So I've seen books and seen videos which deal just with what to do with your hands. Keep them in your pocket, don't keep them in your pocket. 7 rules of dealing with your hands when you're talking to audiences. It's all nice to have those tools, but I promise you they're secondary. All that comes after you deal with the big picture, the big ideas, after you have decided for yourself, what is that one message that I want everyone in my audience to go home with? If everybody just remembered one thing about my talk, about whatever my topic is, what is that one piece that they should remember? That's really the thing you really focus on. And people often talk about the elevator speed. Have you heard about this? If you do you know what? Go ahead.
It's like when you're giving a quick speech for what you're doing to someone you see on the elevator.
Right. So the scenario is you meet Elon Musk and you have the big idea for the next lithium battery, and you and Elon Musk are in the same elevator, and you have 3 floors to tell him how your battery is going to change everything, right? So I often say that you have to take that one step further, which is if somebody in your audience has heard what you said and they will give you an elevator spiel, what would you like them to tell people about your work? So remove it even one step further, which is what is that one simple message that if I am a biologist, a non-biologist in my audience is going to take and say, oh, I heard this speech about biology or this talk about biosciences and this is what I learned. So that message, that you have to have control over. And that, I think, is something that goes beyond simple tips and tricks and where you keep your hands and, you know, do you wear a tie, do you not wear a tie, do you wear a dress, do you wear a skirt? Those things really come secondary. The first primary thing you focus on is simplification and the central message that you want to communicate. So one of the things I like to think about is when you're communicating whatever idea you're communicating, you have to be really compassionate about it. And I know this is kind of an esoteric idea of bringing compassion into good communication, but it is really true because compassionate people don't put up complicated charts on their PowerPoints. You know, they recognize that it's really difficult to look at this. Compassionate people don't put up 300-word slides in their PowerPoint because they recognize that if I put this up, my audience will be bored or they will be disinterested. And the other piece of being compassionate is recognizing that other people are pretty nice too, right? So if you're struggling with whatever you're communicating, it's all right because then you remember that, yeah, other people are very nice, I can deal with this. So one of the things that I like to talk about is, of course, focus on compassion and breathe. So when I was coming up here, I actually tried to take the elevator because I want to keep my breathing as gentle as possible. Right? If I'm running up the stairs, who wants to get their breath up and then talk as if they just came from a marathon? So breathe, go easy on yourself, and then remember the niceness of people. Most people in whatever audience you speak to, like, yes, unless you're an evolutionary scientist and you're speaking to a creationist museum, I don't envy you. But most people, even in those settings, even in hostile settings, when you get on the stage, people are accepting of you. And in being compassionate, you have to be accepting of them. So you have to be accepting of your audience the way it is. Typically, most of us in science communication, whatever we do, we don't face audiences that will throw stuff at us. So recognize that that's a big strength actually. You know, there are people who are facing audiences like that. So, and the final piece is, of course, forget rules. It's good to have, you know, rules about don't keep your hands in your pocket and, you know, don't talk too fast and don't talk too slow and blah blah blah. All those rules are useful, but trust me, you will internalize them with practice. And when you are speaking, you really have to get rid of those rules. And you really have to get rid of those ideas of what is right and what is wrong. All that happens in the preparatory phase. And even when you've done that in your preparation, you will go wrong, and that's absolutely fine. So these are the only tips really I have in terms of being confident while you're speaking. But there are many other resources, and of course OCC has so many other resources which help you. I know Chris was telling me about a confidence in public speaking seminar that you have, and you know, I really encourage you to come and take advantage of those resources. But at the same time, remember that just as your audience will retain only 10% or 15% of what you tell them, when you go to these seminars, you're going to retain only 10-15%. And it's a horrible feeling to go on stage and then ask yourself the question. Last time I was at a public speaking conference, somebody told me, your hands should be in your pocket or should not be in your pocket. To be confused on the stage about such rules is horrible. So when you're on stage, just be yourself, breathe easy. There's this mythical suggestion that imagine your audience is naked and you won't feel nervous. I don't recommend that at all. I don't think if it even could work. But I think it's more important to remember that your audience is typically filled with nice people who are not judging every misstep you take. So be confident in first knowing that you have done your preparation, but also knowing that if you make mistakes here and there, more often than not, your audience is very, very forgiving. Right. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, specific questions about your topics, or if you have an upcoming PowerPoint or a speech that you want to give and you want to discuss it, I'm happy to talk about it.